For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1887 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1887, a bill to amend certain appropriation acts to repeal the requirement directing the Administrator of General Services to sell federal property and assets that support the operations of the Plum Island Animal Disease Center in Plum Island, New York, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ratcliffe, and the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an exchange of letters between the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and the Committee on Homeland Security regarding H.R. 1887.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in support of H.R. 1887, which suspends an appropriations provision in order to ensure that all necessary information is accessible before deciding how to move forward with the Plum Island Animal Disease Center. Since 1954, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate's Plum Island Animal Disease Center has served the nation in defending against accidental or intentional introduction of foreign animal diseases. In 2005, DHS announced that Plum Island would be moved to a new federal facility in Kansas. While DHS will eventually move the research conducted, Plum Island will continue to operate until the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility is fully operational and a complete transition has been made in 2022 or 2023. My friend, the gentleman from New York, Representative Zeldin, introduced H.R. 1887 with strong bipartisan support from the entire Long Island and Connecticut delegations in both the House and the Senate to stop the sale of Plum Island. DHS recently undertook a study on alternatives for the disposition of Plum Island. As amended, H.R. 1887 suspends the sale of Plum Island until a thorough review of the analysis of alternatives is conducted by DHS and GAO. The bill before us today requires GAO to review the DHS study and report to Congress on whether the methodologies DHS uses adequately supports the department's findings. If those methodologies are found lacking, GAO must study possible alternative uses for Plum Island and possible costs associated for the transition and cleanup of the island. H.R. 1887 delays the sale of Plum Island until GAO reports its findings to Congress, allowing for a complete understanding of possible options for Plum Island once the Animal Disease Center functions are transitioned. This bill ensures consideration of all options for the disposition of the island. I urge all members to join me in supporting this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 1888 and yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since 1954, the Plum Island Animal Disease Center in New York's Long Island Sound has served as the primary laboratory in the United States responsible for research on foreign animal diseases of livestock, such as foot and mouth disease and other animal diseases that could be accidentally or deliberately introduced into the United States. At Plum Island, the Department of Homeland Security works with the Agriculture Research Service and Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service within the U.S. Department of Agriculture to research and develop new vaccines and diagnostic tests to respond to animal disease outbreaks. Since September 11, 2005, DHS announced plans to develop the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility, or NBAF, as a state-of-the-art biocontainment laboratory to place the Plum Island facility, an aging facility nearing the end of its life cycle. After undertaking a multi-year site selection process, DHS selected a site in Manhattan, Kansas for the NBAF. It is slated to begin operation in 2022. This brings us to H.R. 1887. The focus of this bill is to deal with the question of what to do with Plum Island once DHS no longer needs it. DHS is currently studying the range of options for disposition of the property, including transferring it to another federal agency, a state or local government, or a nonprofit organization for the purposes of education, research, or conservation. In doing so, DHS is expected to assess the full implications of each option, including cost, cleanup, and hazard mitigation. H.R. 1887 requires the General Accountability Office, or GAO, to assess whether DHS's forthcoming study is adequate to support its finding. In the event that the study is lacking in a key area, GAO would be required to conduct its own study on that issue or issues. Importantly, H.R. 1887 prohibits the sale of Plum Island operations until at least 180 days after the required reports in the bill have been submitted to Congress. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to my distinguished colleague, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Radcliffe, Mr. Thompson as well, for both speaking in favor of this legislation, H.R. 1887. Plum Island's not for sale. The whole purpose of this legislation is to prevent the sale of Plum Island by the federal government to the highest bidder. Situated at the gateway Long Island Sound, Plum Island is treasured by my local community. As a critical resource for research, approximately 90% of the land on Plum Island has been sheltered from development, offering Long Island a diverse wildlife and ecosystem and critical habitat for migratory birds, marine mammals, and rare plants. With recorded history dating back to the 1700s, Plum Island is also an essential cultural and historical resource as well. Since World War II, Plum Island has been utilized as a research laboratory. The facility, which has been under federal jurisdiction since 1899, has since grown to become what is known today as the Plum Island Animal Disease Center. In 2005, the Department of Homeland Security, which currently has jurisdiction over the island, announced that the Animal Disease Center research would be moved to a new federal facility, the Bio and Agro Defense Facility in Kansas. To offset the cost of the relocation, a law was enacted that called for the private sale of Plum Island to the highest bidder. However, due to the costs associated with the cleanup and closure of Plum Island, and because of local zoning restrictions, the federal government would receive little compensation for the sale of Plum Island. Allowing for continued research, public access, and permanent preservation of the island, H.R. 1887 will reverse a 2008 law that mandated the sale of Plum Island. The bill as amended will commission the Government Accountability Office, in consultation with the Department of Homeland Security, which currently owns the island, to formulate a comprehensive plan for the future of the island. This plan will include possible alternative uses, which could include transfer of ownership to another federal agency, the state or local government, nonprofit, or combination thereof for the purpose of education, research, and conservation. Just less than 3 weeks ago, on April 28, 2016, H.R. 1887 was marked up with an amendment and passed out of the House Homeland Security Committee with unanimous bipartisan support. Currently, 24 Republicans and Democrats in this chamber have signed on as co-sponsors of this bill. I see the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, who is here, who has long been championing this issue since before I got here. I would especially like to thank House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy and House Homeland Security Committee Chairman Michael McCall for both taking such a direct personal interest in helping with this effort in the House. Their leadership is very much appreciated. I would also like to thank all the local elected officials, groups, and concerned residents on Long Island, and elsewhere who have moved heaven and earth to raise awareness of this cause and help recruit co-sponsors. I encourage all my colleagues to vote in support of this critical bill. Hopefully the Senate also passes this long-awaited legislation in earnest so that the President can sign this proposal into law this year. I've had the opportunity to visit Plum Island. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. You feel like you're thousands of miles away from Long Island. You have the history of Fort Terry, the coastline and the dunes, the waterways, the water hitting the rocks, the seals. You literally feel like you're nowhere near the northeast of the United States. It is a treasure. It's one that should be protected, and I am very grateful of this chamber considering this legislation and hopefully passing it unanimously. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to first of all thank Mr. Thompson for his interest and support in this measure, even though he hails from a part of the country which is far away from Long Island Sound. But again, going back to his days on the Agriculture Committee, he clearly knows the forensics of this legislation, and again, his interest and support is much appreciated. Mr. Radcliffe, thank you for bringing this bill out today. Again, Long Island Sound maybe is not right on your radar screen, but as Congressman Zeldin said, you know, it's an incredibly special place, a tidal estuary which separates Connecticut from New York, and it is within the New York territory, but frankly, it's a very small, densely populated area, and the interest level on both sides of Long Island Sound in terms of passage of this legislation is off the charts. And I, again, want to thank Mr. Zeldin for his efforts. Again, this measure started in 2013 in response to the GSA report that basically signaled that the sale of this island was on the fast track, and it really took persistence up till today's vote on the floor to make sure that we stop that process, as Mr. Zeldin indicated, and send the message that Plum Island is not for sale. Again, because of its unique history, you know, it's the activity that took place there with the Animal Disease Control Center made it unsuitable for residential development and commercial development, but sort of the outcome of that is that this incredible you know, rich diversity of biology has sprung up there, and like the gentleman from Long Island, I've had the opportunity to visit there, and it is like you are in a different world, and that is something that you know, we can never take for granted, particularly in a part of the country where, again, there's just tremendous amounts of sea traffic, maritime activity, economic activity, to try and, again, basically preserve this 840-acre parcel with its incredible richness is something that really will live on for generations, and really, I think, will make the 114th Congress memorable, certainly in terms of that region for many years to come. Again, like the gentleman from New York, I want to just say the external pressure which was brought to bear by municipal officials, by folks from Save the Sound, and that's an umbrella group on both sides of Long Island Sound, the Connecticut Fund for the Environment, again, is what really kept the interest level and the pressure on both delegations to make sure that this didn't get sort of lost in the process and allow that mandated sale to move forward. So again, I strongly urge passage of this bill, and again, with the gentleman from New York, I'm determined to make sure that this moves as quickly as possible through the upper chamber and is signed into law by President Obama, and again, send a message to all the individuals and groups that are so interested in preserving Plum Island that, in fact, we, again, have taken it off this sort of conveyor belt, and we're going to make sure that it gets the careful treatment that it deserves, and at the end of the day is going to basically preserve this for generations to come. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no other speakers. If the gentleman from Mississippi has no other speakers, I'm prepared to close once the gentleman does.
The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also have no further speakers, and I am prepared to close at this time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1888 has broad bipartisan support. It will ensure that before DHS disposes of Plum Island, there's a thorough vetting of all the options. I encourage my colleagues to support this legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I once again urge my colleagues to support Mr. Zeldin's bill, H.R. 1887, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1887 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.